We learned from these social entrepreneurs this morning that pessimism is an indulgence, and I'd like to remind you that we're lucky enough to have lived through a time when two events have occurred that 1,000 years from now will be remembered by our descendants. And one, of course, was revealed to us by Dave Gallo yesterday, and this was the extraordinary moment when the astronauts on Christmas Eve went around the dark side of the moon to reveal for the first time in human history not a sunrise or a moonrise, but an earthrise. And the entire paradigm shifted. And the second journey was one deep within our own bodies, to the cellular level. And nothing in our experience has done more to, in a sense, liberate the humanity from the parochial tyrannies that have haunted us since the dawn of memory than the genius and the revelations of modern genetics. Biologists have finally proven it to be true, something that philosophers have always dreamt to be true. We are all quite literally brothers and sisters, and I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean quite literally we are cut from the same genetic cloth. Studies of the human genome leave absolutely no doubt whatsoever that the entire human essence is derived from a handful of individuals who walked out of Africa roughly 60,000 years ago, and in 2,500 generations, a Hijra of 40,000 years, carried our species to every corner of the habitable world. And if we accept the fact that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, it follows that we all, by definition, have the same raw mental acuity, the same intellectual capacity. And whether this genius is placed into technological wizardry, which has been the great achievement of the West, or by contrast, into unraveling the complex threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no hierarchy in the affairs of culture. There is no social Darwinian ladder to success. There's no pyramid that conveniently places Victorian society at the apex of a pyramid that slips down to the so-called primitives of the world. That concept has been shown to be as much an artifact of the 19th century as indeed was the idea of a clergyman in the Victorian era that the earth was only 6,000 years old. Now, if the brilliance of scientific research has affirmed in an astonishing way the essential connectedness of humanity, the great revelation of cultural anthropology is the idea that the world into which you were born does not exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of one particular set of adaptive choices that your lineage followed, however successfully, many generations ago. But the other peoples of the world are not failed attempts at being you, or failed attempts to being modern. By contrast, and quite to the opposite, they're unique expressions of the human heart and human imagination, unique answers to a fundamental question: what does it mean to be human and alive? And when asked that question, the myriad of cultures of the world respond with 7,000 different voices, and those voices collectively become our human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us as a species in the ensuing millennia. Now, that revelation puts into stark contrast the data from the linguistic community, where there is an absolute academic consensus that of the 7,000 languages spoken on Earth today, fully half aren't being whispered into the ears of infants, which means they're on the route to elimination. And what this means, without any doubt, is we are living through a time where the hidden backdrop of our age is the fact that humanity is about to lose half of its social, intellectual, and spiritual legacy in a single generation. This does not have to happen. At the National Geographic, in our Cultures Initiative, we confronted this dilemma and asked ourselves, what can we do about it? Well, polemics are never persuasive. Politicians, as we've heard today, rarely lead anywhere. But we believe at the Geographic that storytellers can change the world. So 10 years ago, I began to embark on a series of journeys to places around the world where the beliefs were so dazzling, so extraordinary, that just to know about them would change your way that you viewed and valued culture. After all, you can't make a protected area of the mind. You can't make a rainforest park of culture. All we can do is change the way we all view and value culture. So let's begin in the greatest culture sphere ever brought into being by the human imagination, Polynesia. the entire Pacific Ocean, and I sailed in the Hokulea, a reconstructed catamaran, with the sailors of the Polynesian Voyaging Society. These are sailors who even today can name 250 stars in the night sky. These are sailors who can sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon simply by watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of the vessel, knowing full well that every island group in the Pacific has its own unique refractive pattern. These are sailors who, in the darkness of the hull of the canoe, can distinguish as many as 5 different sea swells moving through the vessel at any one point in time, distinguishing patterns caused by local weather disturbances from the great currents that pulsate across the ocean and can be followed with the same ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. If you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would get is Polynesia. What about realms of the spirit? We made a film called The Science of the Mind about Tibetan Buddhism. Why did we use that term? Well, our conduit to Tibetan culture was Mathieu Ricard, who had been a molecular biologist at the Pasteur Institute in Paris until he became ordained as a Tibetan monk. And Mathieu used to say, Western science is too often a major response to minor needs. We spend all of our lifetime trying to live to be 100 without losing our teeth. We in Tibet spend all of our lifetime trying to understand the nature of existence. And the essence of the Tibetan path is, of course, the Four Noble Truths. All life is suffering. By that, the Buddha didn't mean that life was negative. He meant that things happened. The cause of suffering is ignorance. By this, the Buddha didn't mean stupidity. He meant the tendency of human beings to cling to the cruel illusion of our own centrality. The third of the Noble Truths was simply the revelation that ignorance could be overcome. And the fourth was the delineation of a contemplative practice that not only had the possibility of a transformation of the human heart, but had 2,500 years of direct empirical observation as to the nature of mind, showing that such a transformation could indeed happen. We went on a pilgrimage to the high Himalaya, not to climb the mountains, but to be in the presence of a true wisdom hero of the Tibetan tradition, a bodhisattva, an enlightened being who has spent all of her time in the realm of samsara, facilitating the liberation of other sentient creatures. This was a woman who 45 years ago went into solitary retreat in a small cell of a nunnery. This photograph was taken the moment that door opened on her life for the first time in 45 years. And you did not meet a madwoman. You met a face radiant with serenity. And for the Buddhists, the proof of the efficacy of the science for the mind that is Tibetan Buddhism is, in fact, the serenity achieved by the individual who follows the contemplative practice. A Lama once said to me in Tibet, "We in Tibet don't believe that you went to the moon, but you did. You may not believe that we achieve enlightenment in one lifetime, but we do." Now, what about the idea of sacred geography? What does it really mean to be in a place where you literally believe the earth is alive, animate, responsive to the human desire, and that the human desire has its own reciprocal obligations to look after the earth? Well, in the great agricultural cultures of the Andes and the Himalaya, these are places where this idea is reflexive, because these are farmers who literally see the mountains controlling the rain that brings fertility to the crops. And great rituals occur to affirm this sense of place. One of which, in the community of Chinchero, where I've been affiliated for almost 35 years now, the fastest young boy, once each year, is given the honor of becoming a woman. And he dresses up in the clothing of his sister, and he must lead all able-bodied men on a run. But it's not your ordinary run. You start off at 11,500 feet, run 3,000 feet down to the base of the sacred mountain of Antakilka, and then soar up to 16,000 feet, only to fall away over 2 more soaring Andean ridges. And the metaphor is clear. The Wailaka must spin to bring the vortex of the feminine to the mountaintop. He must give coca leaves to the earth. The individuals go into the mountain as individuals, but through exhaustion and sacrifice, they emerge transformed as members of a community that once again has reaffirmed its sense of connection, obligation to the earth. Now, these rituals in the Andes become these fantastic pan-Andean events like the Coyariti, which occurs after the Pleiades rise in the sky before Corpus Christi, Tens of thousands of Andean peoples from all over Bolivia and Peru converge in the sacred valley of the Sinicara, where a divine event happened both at the time of Columbus and in pre-Columbian times, an apparition of Christ. And in this perfect fusion of pre-Columbian ideas and Christianity that is a reality of Andean Peru, the crosses are carried from the communities high in the shadow of the most sacred mountain, planted in the ice to be empowered overnight that they can be carried away, recharged with energy the following day. Then the people themselves embrace that cycle of the divine in all of their subsequent spiritual practices. Now, if a place like that is an echo of this incredible fusion of the two worlds of pre-Columbian South America, there is one place where the ancient voice remains heard, unfettered, and alive. And this is in the homeland of the Elder Brother. The Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, a massive volcanic range that soars out of the Caribbean coastal plain, and in the blood-stained continent, only the Arahuacos and the Kogi were never conquered by the Spanish. To this day, they remain ruled by a ritual priesthood of mamos, but the training for the priesthood is extraordinary. This young man walked into my office at the National Geographic one day at the head of a political delegation, and I reminded him that I had met him before because he was the son of my good friend here on your right, Adalberto, who had been killed by the paramilitaries. I reminded Danilo that as an infant I had carried him on my back up and down the mountains, and based on that serendipitous connection, we were invited to do something no one had ever done. Literally accompany the initiates on the sacred journey to the ice. The acolytes are taken away from their families at the age of 2 and 3, sequestered in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years. 2 9-year periods deliberately chosen to mimic the 9 months of gestation in their natural mother's womb. Now they're metaphorically in the womb of the Great Mother. And for that entire time, the world only exists as an abstraction, as they are taught the values of their culture, values that maintain the idea that their prayers and ritual gestures alone maintain the cosmic balance. After 18 years, the initiate is suddenly taken out into the light and for the first time sees the world as it is on this incredible journey to what they call the heart of the world, Saranqua, the Great Mother. And even the deportment or the costume they wear is a deliberate attempt to echo the sacred snows of the mountains. And it's extraordinary to think that 2 hours from Miami Beach, these individuals right now are praying for our collective well-being. They call themselves the Elder Brothers. They dismiss the rest of us that they fear have ruined the world as their younger brothers. They speak in full paragraphs about our obligations to regenerate a new way of thinking about the earth. I was in Copenhagen, and one of the things that struck me there was this idea we have that climate change, which clearly is occurring, is somehow humanity's problem. It may become humanity's problem, but it was not humanity that caused it to happen. It was a narrow subset of humanity. Much of humanity embraced quite different attitudes towards the earth. I made a film on the songlines in the Dreamtime in Australia. I always wanted to live with Aboriginal people in Australia because these were the first humans to walk out of Africa. Studies by our colleagues, Sylvia and myself, Spencer Wells of the Y chromosome, has left no doubt that the Australians were the first to walk out of Africa, and in very short order they reached to this parsimonious continent. And then they continued to walk, establishing 10,000 clan territories that were a matrix across the entire continent, a matrix of cultural realities linked together by a single idea, which was the dream time, the dreaming. Now, when the British first got there, they saw people that were simple, looked weird, clearly had not chosen to improve upon their lot. This not only offended the British, it was deeply offensive to their entire sensibility, because the ethos, of course, of 19th century Europe was the cult of improvement, an idea that died in the blood of Flanders, but was very much the ethos of the age. And so when they met the Aboriginal people, they were deeply offended, and they concluded in their inimitable way that these were savages, and they began to shoot them. As recently as 1902, it was debated in the Parliament of Australia whether Aboriginal people were human beings. As recently as 1960, a textbook in Australia, A Treasury of Fauna of Australia, included the Aboriginal people as amongst the interesting wildlife of the country. But what was really going on What was going on was one of the most subtle philosophical ideas ever to come out of human devotion. This was a dreaming. The dreaming wasn't a dream. It was a state of perpetual reality, and not one of the 670 dialects and languages of Australia is there a word for time. There is no word for past, present, or future. There is only the dreaming, which is both the eternal now, the future to come, and the past, all woven into multidimensional space. The ethos of the Aboriginal way of life is the antithesis of improvement. On the contrary, it's a devotional culture of stasis. The goal of life is not to improve upon anything, but merely to do the ritual gestures necessary in your clan territory to maintain the world exactly as it was the time of the first dawning, when the rainbow serpent spread across the earth and the ancestral beings sang the universe into existence. It's as if all of Western intellectual thought had been devoted strictly to maintaining the Garden of Eden exactly as it was at the time of the first fateful conversation between Adam and Eve. I'm not saying which attitude is right or wrong, but had we followed that devotional track, yes, we would not have put a man on the moon, but we also wouldn't be speaking about our capacity to transform the biological life supports of the planet, and that's what's happening. There's a lot of loose talk about climate change, but one needs only to go to the Arctic to see the reality of the ice melting. I traveled from Baffin Island to Ellesmere Island and across Smith Sound to the northwest corner of Greenland to live with the northernmost people in the world, the polar Eskimo of Kanak. We went walrus hunting and found to our astonishment that there was no ice. In their language, the word sila means both weather and consciousness, because weather is created out of the human imagination. The human imagination, in turn, is a measure of the environment. Their ice used to come in August and stay until November, and now it comes in, and stay until July. Now it comes in November and is gone by March. Their world has been cut in half, and whatever's going on, I can assure you the ice is melting. And so the real question then becomes, what kind of world do we want to live in? It's not about the traditional or the modern. It's about the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives. People say, what does it matter to us here in Florida if some tribal society in Asia disappears? Well, probably nothing. But what does it matter to that society if Florida disappears? Nothing. But surely the world would be a more impoverished place were either event to occur. And the most important lesson to come out of anthropology is that culture is not trivial. And this is why the ultimate message is so profoundly conservative. Culture is not trivial. It's not decorative. It's not the songs we sing, the prayers, the costumes. Ultimately, culture is about a body of moral and ethical values that every society places around the individual to keep at bay the barbaric heart that history teaches us lies just beneath the surface of the living. It is culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, to find order and meaning in a universe that may have none. It is culture that allows us, as Lincoln said, to always seek the better angels of our nature. And if you want to know what happens when culture is lost, yet the individual survives, a shadow of their former selves, cast adrift in an uncertain world without the roots of tradition, you merely have to look at the places of chaos in the world, the killing fields of Cambodia, the insanity of Mogadishu, the butt-naked brigades in Liberia, and indeed the homicidal mania of an Al-Qaeda. This is what happens when culture is lost. It does not have to happen. It's not about the traditional versus the modern. It's about what kind of world are we going to live in? How are we going to find a way to really live free of cultural myopia, with open borders of the imagination, so that every voice of humanity has its rightful place at the council of human knowledge. This is indeed is happening. These aren't societies destined to fade away. These are societies that in every instance are dynamic living peoples being confronted by identifiable forces, which is the most optimistic observation of all. Because if human beings are the creators of cultural destruction, we can surely be the facilitators of cultural survival. And what we at the National Geographic are doing every week, every month, is committing ourselves to the celebration not only of the beauty and power of the seas, the wonder of biodiversity, the promise of the human heart, and the radiance of all culture, because culture is who we are as a species. Thank you.